My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 33 years old. I work as a physical therapist at a sports medicine clinic in Portland, Oregon, and 9 years into my marriage, my mother-in-law looked at me across her own dining room table, in front of my husband, his sister, and 4 other people, and said, "Some people bring something to this family. Some people just take up a chair." I didn't say anything back. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, and set it down without a sound. The room was warm, the kind of warm that comes from too many candles and too much wine, and for a moment, nobody at that table moved, waiting, I think, to see whether I'd cry, or snap back, or excuse myself to the bathroom the way I had after smaller comments in years past. I did none of those things. What Linda Kessler didn't know, sitting there so pleased with herself, was that I had spent the previous 6 weeks quietly pulling together 3 years of bank statements, and that by the following morning, she would understand exactly how much she actually needed the daughter-in-law she'd just called worthless in front of her own family. If you're watching this, welcome back, and if this is your first time here, thank you for stopping by. I want to tell you what happened in my marriage over 9 years. Because I think a lot of you have sat at a table like that one, quietly absorbing a comment that was supposed to sound like a joke, and I want you to know there's a way through it that doesn't require raising your voice even once. Comment the word worthless if you've ever been on the receiving end of a line like that. And stay with me, because what happened by morning surprised even me, not because it was dramatic, but because of exactly how quiet it turned out to be. Let me take you back to where all of this actually started, because the dinner wasn't the beginning, it was the end of 9 years of something I didn't have a name for until very recently. I met my husband, Nathan Mitchell, in 2015 when we were both 25 at a mutual friend's barbecue in Beaverton. He was a software engineer, quiet, steady, the kind of person who remembers your coffee order after hearing it once. We got married in the fall of 2017 in a small ceremony at his mother's church, and from the very beginning, his family operated on a set of rules I didn't fully understand until years later, because nobody ever said them out loud. Linda Kessler, his mother, was 61 years old at the time of that dinner, a retired elementary school teacher who had spent 32 years in the same district in Salem, Oregon, widowed since 2019 when Nathan's father, Robert, passed away from a sudden heart attack at 66. Nathan's older sister, Jessica Kessler Hale, 37, married to a man named Craig with 2 kids, had always occupied a different position in that family than I did, and I want to give you a specific memory that shows you the shape of it, rather than just telling you about it. I want to be clear about the roles those 2 siblings had held since childhood, because Nathan explained this to me plainly, years into our marriage, in a way that finally made sense of things I'd been observing for a long time. Jessica, 4 years older than Nathan, had struggled academically as a child, been held back a grade in 3rd grade, and had gone through a difficult stretch as a teenager that included, Nathan told me once, a period of self-harm in her mid-teens that Linda had never fully processed or spoken about openly, even decades later. Nathan, by contrast, had been the steady one, good grades, a scholarship to Oregon State, a stable engineering career by 24. Linda had, according to Nathan, spent Jessica's entire childhood terrified that her daughter was one bad year away from falling apart completely, and that fear, unaddressed and unspoken, had calcified over decades into an almost automatic instinct to protect Jessica financially and emotionally from any discomfort at all, regardless of the actual circumstances in front of her. I want to hold that context honestly, because it explains something about where Linda's behavior came from, even though it never excuses what it grew into. At Thanksgiving in 2018, my second one with the family, Linda spent the entire dinner talking about how proud she was of Jessica for holding her family together after a difficult year, though, as far as I could tell, Jessica's difficult year had mostly consisted of redecorating her kitchen. When it came time to go around the table and say what everyone was grateful for, Linda said she was grateful for Jessica's strength, for Craig's steady job, for her grandchildren's health, and when it got to me, she paused for just a second too long before saying, "And I suppose we're grateful Sarah keeps Nathan organized." I remember laughing along with everyone else at the table because it was framed as a compliment, technically. It took me years to understand that keeps Nathan organized was Linda's way of describing my entire value to that family. Useful, functional, replaceable. Nathan told me once, in a rare unguarded moment during our first year of marriage, that he'd grown up with an unspoken job of his own, to never be the reason Linda had one more thing to worry about. He said he'd learned, as a teenager, to solve his own problems quietly, to never ask for help unless it was unavoidable, because every ounce of his mother's visible worry, for as long as he could remember, had already been spoken for by Jessica. I think, looking back, that's part of why he never fully registered the pattern forming around me. He'd spent his entire life believing that being low maintenance was simply what love from Linda required, and it never occurred to him, until that spreadsheet, that the same unspoken rule had quietly been transferred onto his wife. The second memory that stands out happened at Christmas in 2019, a few months after Robert died. I'd taken 2 full weeks off work, unpaid, to help Linda sort through Robert's things, file the paperwork with his pension, and manage the funeral logistics that Jessica, by her own admission, just couldn't handle emotionally. I didn't mind doing it. I loved Robert and I loved Nathan and I wanted to help. But at that same Christmas, when Linda handed out gifts, Jessica received a $500 gift card to a spa, and I received a coffee mug that said "World's Best Helper." Nathan noticed. He didn't say anything that night. Later, in the car, he said, "That was a weird gift," and I said it was fine because at 29 years old, 3 years into this marriage, I had already learned that pointing out these small moments out loud made me sound petty, and being called petty felt worse, somehow, than being handed a mug that reduced 2 weeks of unpaid labor to a punchline. The third memory I want to give you happened at my own wedding shower, hosted by Linda before Nathan and I got married. Linda stood up to give a toast and said, "I hope Sarah understands what a lucky woman she is," and then spent the next 4 minutes describing Nathan's virtues without once mentioning anything about me, my career, or what I might bring to the marriage. My own mother, sitting in the back of the room, told me afterward, gently, "That woman thinks you're getting the good end of this deal, and she's going to make sure you know it for the rest of your life." I laughed it off at the time. My mother, it turns out, was more right than either of us understood. There's a fourth memory, too, from earlier than any of these, that I didn't understand the significance of until years later. The very first time Nathan brought me to meet his parents, in the spring of 2016, Linda asked me, within the first 20 minutes of meeting me, what I did for a living. When I told her I was a physical therapist, she said brightly, "Oh, how useful," and then turned immediately to ask Nathan about his latest promotion. I remember driving home that night thinking it was a strange, small comment, nothing worth mentioning to Nathan. I didn't yet know that how useful would turn out to be the single most accurate description Linda would ever give me of how she saw my place in her family. 4 words that predicted nearly a decade of everything that followed. I need to explain something about my profession here, because it becomes important later. I'm a licensed physical therapist, and my hourly clinical rate at the time of most of these events was between $90 and $110 an hour, depending on the type of session. This matters because starting in 2018, Linda began asking me, with increasing frequency, to treat her knee. She had a partial meniscus tear that flared up periodically, not as a professional courtesy once in a while, which I would have happily done, but as a standing, unpaid weekly arrangement that I never formally agreed to and that simply accumulated, session by session, until it became an assumed part of family life. Let me walk you through how this built over the years, because I think the pattern only becomes visible when you see it laid end to end, the way I eventually did. In the first year, 2018, it started small. Linda asked me to look at her knee just once, since you're the expert, after a fall in her garden that spring. I drove to her house on a Saturday, brought my own resistance bands and a portable ultrasound unit I owned for home visits, and spent 90 minutes working through a basic rehab protocol with her. She thanked me, made me a cup of tea, and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you, honestly." I remember feeling genuinely good about that afternoon. I told myself, this is what family does for each other. This is not a big deal. 90 minutes on a Saturday is nothing. At the end of that first session, I remember Linda saying, almost offhandedly, it's nice having someone in the family who actually knows what she's doing about something real, and I took that, at the time, as the warmest thing she'd ever said to me. Looking back, I think it was also the first time she articulated out loud the specific value she'd assigned me, not companionship, not warmth, but competence she could draw on. I need to pause the timeline here and tell you about Robert's funeral itself, because it's its own distinct incident, separate from the physical therapy sessions, and it set a financial pattern that would repeat, in different forms, for years afterward. Robert died suddenly on a Tuesday morning in September of 2019, and the funeral costs came to just under $14,000. Including the service, the burial plot next to a small cemetery outside Salem, and a modest reception afterward. Linda covered roughly $8,000 of that from Robert's life insurance payout. The remaining $6,000, she said at the time, needed to be split among the three of us, herself, Nathan, and Jessica, as a show of unity during a difficult time. Nathan and I contributed $2,000 that October, money we pulled directly from our own savings, no hesitation, because it was our father and grandfather, and covering a fair third felt like the only right thing to do. Jessica, according to what Linda told us at the time, was not in a position to contribute right now, given everything going on with Craig's job, and so her third, another $2,000, was quietly absorbed back into Linda's own remaining insurance funds without ever being repaid or even revisited later. I didn't think much of it in the moment. Grief has a way of making financial asymmetries feel petty to point out. It took me years to recognize that pattern. Someone else's hardship being treated as a permanent excuse, mine treated as simply the baseline expectation, as the very first version of the exact machinery that would define the next 5 years. By the second year, 2019, just once had become every other Saturday, and then, after Robert's death that fall, every single Saturday, without exception, for the rest of that year. Each session ran 90 minutes to 2 hours. At my clinical rate, even the conservative end of $100 an hour, that year alone represented somewhere between $7,000 and $8,000 in professional time I gave without any payment, or frankly, without any acknowledgement beyond a cup of tea, and a repeated version of the same sentence, "I don't know what I'd do without you." Nathan, watching me leave every Saturday morning, would sometimes say, "You don't have to keep doing this, you know." And I would say, "It's fine, it's just a couple hours the way I always did," because the alternative felt like admitting I resented helping my own mother-in-law recover from a painful injury, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who resented that. I remember one Saturday in November of that year, 3 weeks after Robert's funeral, arriving to find Linda had already told 2 of her church friends that her daughter-in-law, the physical therapist, was coming by, framing it, in front of them, as a kind of family prestige rather than as unpaid clinical labor. One of those friends actually asked me that same afternoon what I charged for home visits professionally, and Linda answered for me before I could, saying, "Oh, she doesn't charge family," in a tone that made it sound like generosity rather than what it also was, an assumption made on my behalf, out loud in front of witnesses that I had never actually agreed to. Here's the internal rationalization I want to be honest about, because I think it's the part that actually explains why this went on for so long. I grew up the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs, and I was raised to believe that being needed was a form of being loved, that usefulness and belonging were basically the same thing. When Linda said, "I don't know what I'd do without you," some old, quiet part of me heard that as acceptance, as proof that I'd earned my place in this family the same way I'd earned everything else in my life, through work. I didn't yet understand that a family which only expresses affection in proportion to what you're currently doing for them isn't actually offering you belonging. It's offering you a job with unpaid overtime and a Christmas mug instead of a paycheck. By the third year, 2020, the pandemic hit, and the arrangement shifted but didn't lessen. Linda, isolated and anxious, began calling me 2 or 3 times a week for just a quick check-in on the exercises, calls that regularly ran 45 minutes to an hour. That same year, Jessica and Craig, according to something Nathan mentioned in passing, received $8,000 from Linda toward a home office renovation, funded, Nathan later told me, from Robert's remaining life insurance payout. I didn't think much of that at the time. I want to be honest that I didn't yet have any reason to connect it to anything. I do remember, though, one call in June of that year when Linda mentioned the renovation almost as an aside, then immediately pivoted to asking whether I thought her knee pain was just stress from everything going on, and I spent the next 35 minutes walking her through a modified exercise routine over video call, sitting on my own back porch during what was supposed to be my lunch break from a full clinical caseload. I remember thinking, even then, in passing, that it was strange how naturally the conversation moved from an $8,000 gift to Jessica straight into another free hour of my professional time, as though the two things existed in entirely separate universes that never had to be weighed against each other. The fourth year, 2021, brought what I now think of as the first real escalation. Linda asked Nathan, not me directly, whether Sarah would mind driving her to and from a hip specialist appointment 2 hours away in Eugene, a full-day commitment, on a day I had already requested off work for my own annual physical. I rescheduled my own appointment. Nathan said to me in the car on the way down, she really does appreciate this, even if she doesn't always say it right, which is the kind of sentence that sounds reasonable on its surface and does real work underneath it, because it asks you to translate someone else's lack of gratitude into gratitude you're supposed to imagine on their behalf. During that same drive down to Eugene, Linda spent almost the entire 2 hours talking about how worried she was for Jessica, whose part-time hours had just been cut, and how she was thinking of helping out a little that month. She never once asked how my own workday, the one I'd rescheduled, had been affected by giving up a full Wednesday. I remember glancing at Nathan in the rearview mirror at one point, hoping he'd notice the asymmetry out loud. He didn't, not that day. That same year, in August of 2021, Craig lost his job at a logistics company after a round of layoffs, and the family closed ranks around Jessica's household with a speed and thoroughness I hadn't seen applied to any hardship of my own in 6 years of marriage. Linda gave them $3,500 that month to cover their mortgage payment, framed, again, as a loan, though I never once saw or heard of a single payment made against it in the years since. Nathan and I offered, unprompted, to help as well, and gave them an additional $500 ourselves that September, money we never expected back and never asked about again. What struck me, looking back on that period now, wasn't that Craig and Jessica received help during a genuine hardship. Of course they did, and I don't begrudge them that. What struck me was the total absence of any equivalent safety net ever extended toward Nathan and me, even hypothetically in 9 years of marriage, despite the fact that we had, by that point, quietly contributed more money into that family's various needs than we had ever received back in any form at all. Linda mentioned once, almost as a throwaway line during that same period, "You two are so stable. I never have to worry about you," which I understand now wasn't a compliment so much as a quiet confirmation that stability, in that family's accounting, functioned as a kind of disqualification from ever being considered worth checking on. I want to give you a warmth beat here, because this period wasn't only difficult, and I don't want to paint it that way. That same year, in the fall of 2021, Jessica's younger daughter, Mia, who was 7 at the time, had a minor soccer injury, and I spent an afternoon teaching her simple stretches at Linda's kitchen table, turning it into a game. and she called me Aunt Sarah the Fixer for the rest of that year, delighted every time I visited. Mia is one of the few people in that family who has never once made me feel like my time had a smaller price tag than anyone else's. And I want that on the record, because kids sometimes see things more clearly than the adults raising them. I remember, too, that same afternoon, Mia asking me, with the blunt honesty only a 7-year-old can manage, "Does Grandma pay you for this?" I laughed and told her no, family doesn't pay family, and she said, matter-of-factly, "That seems unfair, you always come when she calls." I didn't have an answer for her that day. I think about that exchange often now. Around that same time, a coworker of mine at the clinic, a physical therapist named Denise, who'd been practicing for almost 20 years, noticed I'd started coming in on Monday mornings looking noticeably more tired than usual, and asked me, over lunch one day in early 2022, what was going on with my weekends. When I explained the standing Saturday arrangement with Linda, Denise set down her sandwich and said, "Plainly, Sarah, if a client asked you to do that every week for 4 years for free, what would you call that arrangement?" I told her I'd call it exploitation, professionally speaking, and she said, "Right, so why is the answer different just because it's family?" I didn't have a good answer for her either. That day, though, the question stayed with me, quietly, for a long time afterward, resurfacing every single Saturday morning I got in my car and drove to Linda's house without ever having actually agreed, out loud, to make it a permanent arrangement. There's one more incident from that 4th year I want to include, because it's small on its own but part of the same pattern. In July of 2021, Linda organized a family trip to the Oregon coast, a rented house in Lincoln City for a week, and told everyone the cost would be split evenly, 4 ways, among herself, Nathan and me, and Jessica and Craig, roughly $600 per household for the rental alone. Nathan and I paid our $600 up front, the week before the trip, the way we always did with any shared family expense. 2 months later, going through our own bank records for tax purposes, I noticed the charge and mentioned it to Nathan, only to learn, almost by accident, that Jessica and Craig had never actually paid their share at all. Linda had quietly covered it herself, so nobody had to worry about it during a hard year, and had simply never mentioned that adjustment to Nathan or me. It wasn't a large sum in isolation. What stayed with me wasn't the $600, it was the discovery, small as it was, that evenly split in this family had never actually meant evenly split. It had meant, however Linda decided things should land once nobody was watching closely enough to check. The 5th year, 2022, is when the financial patterns started overlapping directly with money Nathan and I contributed ourselves. That January, Nathan and I set up what we called a family emergency fund, a joint savings account we both contributed $200 a month to, specifically earmarked, according to the conversation we'd had with Linda at the time, for unexpected repairs on Mom's house, since she's on a fixed income now. Over that year, we contributed $4,800 combined. In March of that year, Linda told us the water heater needed replacing at a cost of $1,100, which we covered from the fund. In August, she told us the roof needed a repair after a storm, $3,200, also covered from the fund. I didn't think to ask for receipts. Nathan didn't either. Family doesn't ask family for receipts, Linda used to say, and at the time, that sentence sounded like warmth instead of what it actually was, which was a rule designed to make sure nobody ever checked her math. I remember asking, once, in September of that year, almost apologetically, whether I could see the roofer's invoice just for our own records. And Linda's response was quick and a little sharp. "Are you saying you don't trust me?" I dropped it immediately. I didn't want to be the daughter-in-law who made her mother-in-law feel accused over a home repair. I understand now that "are you saying you don't trust me" is one of the most effective sentences in that entire family's vocabulary, because it transforms a completely reasonable request for documentation into an accusation of bad faith and almost nobody wants to be the one who caused that discomfort, even when the discomfort is entirely reasonable to raise. The sixth year, 2023, is when Linda asked me, directly this time, whether I could help out watching Jessica's kids 2 afternoons a week during summer break. Since Jessica's part-time job had picked up extra hours and daycare was, in Linda's words, just so expensive right now. I want you to notice something about that sentence, because it's a perfect example of the machinery I mentioned at the start of this story. It frames an unpaid labor request as a simple favor between family members, while quietly establishing that my time, unlike daycare's time, doesn't cost anything, doesn't need to be budgeted for, doesn't require the same respect as a stranger's hourly rate. I said yes. I rearranged 2 afternoons of my work schedule for 11 weeks that summer, at a real cost to my own client caseload and income, roughly $2,000 in reduced hours according to my own pay stubs, which I only calculated much later. I remember one particular Wednesday that August, watching Mia and Dylan at Linda's house while Linda herself went to get her hair done and Jessica went to a spa afternoon Craig had booked as an anniversary gift, and thinking, half amused and half something else, that I had somehow become the free daycare underwriting everyone else's paid relaxation. That same summer, in July of 2023, I discovered, not dramatically, just by overhearing half of a phone call while I was in the next room, that Linda had given Jessica and Craig $6,000 toward a down payment on a used car. The same month, she told Nathan and me that her retirement account was tighter than it used to be, and that she might need to lean on the emergency fund a little more heavily going forward. I remember standing in that hallway, holding a laundry basket, feeling something shift slightly in my chest, though I still didn't have a full picture of what I was looking at. I also remember, later that same week, mentioning the car offhandedly to Nathan, who said, "I'm sure Mom just wanted to help them out. It's not like she's hiding anything," a sentence he would later, in October, describe to me as one of the most embarrassing things he'd ever said, because by then he understood exactly how much had, in fact, been hidden. I want to add one more detail from that sixth year because it matters for what comes later. In September of 2023, I asked Linda, gently, whether she'd ever consider paying even a token rate for the physical therapy sessions, not out of resentment, but because my clinic had started tracking my community hours for a continuing education requirement, and I genuinely needed some kind of documentation. Linda's response was, "Sarah, if you're going to start treating your own family like clients, I don't know what to say to you," delivered in a hurt, wounded tone that made me feel, immediately, like the unreasonable one for asking. I dropped the request. I didn't bring it up again for over a year. If you've ever been the one who's expected to fix everything while somebody else gets asked how they're feeling about it, I want you to comment worthless below if you haven't already, because we're at the halfway point of this story, and what's coming is the part where the numbers finally start to add up in a way that's impossible to unsee. I'll say this much now. Before we get there, the hardest part was never finding the proof. It was believing I was allowed to look for it in the first place. There's one more pattern I want to name before I move into the seventh year, because it ran underneath almost everything else, the same way the same way a person's public reputation can quietly reinforce a private imbalance. Linda was, and still is, an active member of her church community in Salem, a congregation of maybe 200 families. And for years she used that community as a kind of stage for Jessica's life in particular. She organized a baby shower through the church for Jessica's second pregnancy in 2016, before I'd even met the family, and continued, year after year, to bring Jessica and the kids to church events, introducing Jessica proudly as my daughter, the one who never stops giving to this family. I was rarely invited to those same events, in part because Linda's church was an hour from where Nathan and I lived, but also, I came to understand over time, because I simply didn't fit the story she'd built for that audience. The story of a devoted, ever-present daughter and a competent, useful, background daughter-in-law who existed mostly to keep her son organized. One of Linda's church friends, a kind older woman named Pauline, who I met exactly twice over 9 years, once told me, at Robert's funeral of all places, Linda talks about Jessica so much. I feel like I know her, but she's never once mentioned what you do for a living. I laughed it off at the time, the way I laughed off so many things. I understand now that comment was its own small piece of evidence, offered up by a total stranger, of exactly how invisible my contributions to that family had been allowed to become, even to the people who saw Linda every single week. The 7th year, 2024, is when things accelerated. In February, Linda asked Nathan for $4,000, framed as a loan to cover a medical bill she said insurance hadn't fully covered. Nathan gave it to her from our joint account without discussing the amount with me first, which was its own small fracture I didn't fully address at the time. I remember finding out about that transfer 3 weeks after it happened, seeing it on our own bank statement almost by accident, and asking Nathan about it that evening. He said, "She said it was urgent. I didn't want to make her explain herself over text," and I remember feeling a familiar, exhausted resignation settle over me. The sense that questioning any of this always somehow ended up framed as my failure of compassion rather than a reasonable question about our own joint money. In April, I learned, through a group text Jessica had accidentally sent to the wrong thread, that the medical bill had actually been used to cover half of a down payment on the lake house Jessica and Craig were purchasing that spring, a 2-bedroom cabin on a small lake 90 minutes outside Portland, listed at $310,000. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after reading that message, rereading the 2 sentences that made it unmistakable. Mom said the fork she got from Nathan basically covered our closing costs. Don't say anything, lol. I didn't say anything either, not right away. I wanted to understand the full shape of it before I said a single word out loud. Here's a small warmth beat from that same spring, because I think it matters. Nathan, without my prompting, noticed something was off in me during that period, and one night in May he asked, directly, "Is something going on with my mom that I'm not seeing?" It was the first time in 9 years he'd asked me that question first, instead of me having to bring it up and risk sounding petty. I didn't answer fully that night. I told him I needed some time to think it through properly before I said anything I couldn't take back. He said, "Okay, take your time. I trust you. I want you to hold on to that moment because it becomes important later." Over that summer and into the fall of 2024, I started, quietly and without telling anyone except one person, going back through 9 years of bank statements, texts, and my own work calendar. I want to explain exactly what I found because the specificity matters. Between 2018 and 2024, I calculated that I had provided approximately 310 hours of unpaid physical therapy sessions to Linda, which, at my conservative clinical rate of $100 an hour, represented $31,000 in professional labor. Separately, I calculated that I had provided roughly 140 hours of unpaid childcare for Jessica's children, representing, at a reasonable babysitting rate of $20 an hour, $2,800. Though, I want to be clear, that was never really about the money for me. It was about the pattern. The fact that my time was treated as free by default while Jessica's time, and increasingly Linda's own money, moved in the opposite direction toward Jessica, without hesitation or accounting. On the financial side, cross-referencing our joint family emergency fund statements against texts and the accidental group message, I found that of the roughly $9,600 Nathan and I had contributed to that fund, over 3 years, at least $6,300 had gone toward expenses that had nothing to do with repairs on Linda's house, the $6,000 car down payment for Jessica and Craig, and the $4,000 medical bill that had actually funded half of a lake house closing. I sat at my kitchen table with all of this laid out across 3 spreadsheets one evening in September, and I remember thinking, very clearly, in a voice that didn't sound angry so much as simply awake, this was never a family taking care of each other. This was a machine, and I had been quietly funding one half of it in cash and the other half of it in unpaid hours, for 6 years while being told every step of the way how lucky I was to be needed. The discovery itself, the moment that made all of this undeniable rather than just suspicious, happened on a Tuesday evening in October of 2024. I was helping Nathan back up old photos from his childhood laptop, one of those tasks you put off for years, and in doing so, I came across an old shared cloud folder that Linda had apparently had access to since 2019, originally set up, so she could see photos from Robert's memorial service. In that folder, alongside those old photos, was a spreadsheet Linda herself had built, titled Family Support 2019-2024, clearly not intended for anyone else to see, that tracked, in her own handwriting style, translated into a digital format, every dollar she had given to each of her children, with a column at the far right labeled simply Notes. Next to nearly every entry involving Jessica, the notes read things like needs it more or Craig's job unstable, don't mention to Sarah. Next to entries involving Nathan and me, the emergency fund contributions we'd made ourselves, our own money, the notes read things like Sarah won't ask questions if I frame it as repairs, and in one entry from earlier that same year, S is useful. Keep her close, don't let N see full picture. I sat very still in that chair for a long time after reading that last line. I didn't cry. I didn't call out for Nathan, who was in the next room. I just sat there, looking at 4 words, keep her close, useful, that took 9 years of vague discomfort and organized it, instantly, into something I could finally name out loud. That's the machinery of it, I remember thinking, almost clinically, the way I might describe a diagnosis to a patient. I hadn't been loved less than Jessica because I'd done something wrong. I had been managed deliberately as a resource while being told in every soft and reasonable sounding sentence Linda ever gave me that this was simply what family looked like. I scrolled back further in that same spreadsheet, past the entry that had stopped me cold, and found the pattern extended even further than I'd realized. There was an entry from 2020 during the height of the pandemic that read, next to a $200 grocery delivery Linda had accepted from us without ever mentioning it again, N and S cover groceries some months, don't need to thank them every time, keeps it normal. There was another, from early 2022, right around when the emergency fund was first established, that read, fund idea good, S will track it carefully, easier to justify withdrawals if she thinks it's organized. Reading that particular line, I understood that even the one system I'd built specifically to bring transparency into this family's finances had been, from the very beginning, viewed by Linda not as accountability, but as a kind of camouflage she could operate behind, confident that my own instinct for careful record-keeping would end up protecting her instead of catching her. I closed the laptop and didn't say anything to Nathan that night. I needed, first, to talk to someone who wasn't standing inside this family's orbit at all. I remember lying awake beside him for hours, listening to him breathe, feeling the strange, specific loneliness of holding a piece of information that was about to change the shape of both of our families, and not yet being ready to hand him that weight. The person I called was my closest friend from nursing school, a woman named Priya. Different Priya than anyone else you might have heard about in a story like this. Just a coincidence of a common name, who now works as a financial counselor, and who has known me since before I ever met Nathan. I met her for coffee that Thursday and laid out everything, the ledger, the 310 hours, the $6,300, the note that said, keep her close, useful. She listened without interrupting for almost the entire time, and when I finished, she asked me one question that I think is the real emotional center of everything that happened after. If you stopped being useful to that family tomorrow, who would you be to them? I didn't have an answer. I sat there, in a coffee shop on a Thursday afternoon, 33 years old, 9 years into my marriage, and realized I genuinely did not know the answer to that question, and that the not knowing terrified me more than anything Linda had ever said to my face. I want to sit with that fear a little longer because I think it's the part of this story most people skip past too quickly. It would have been easy for me to tell you I discovered the spreadsheet and simply decided, cleanly that enough was enough. That isn't what happened. What happened is that I spent nearly 2 weeks in a kind of quiet, suspended state, going to work, coming home, cooking dinner, behaving completely normally on the surface, while underneath I kept circling the same unanswerable question Priya had asked me. I thought about the fact that I had built almost my entire adult identity, at least within this particular family, around being the capable one, the one who fixed things, the one who could be relied on without complaint. I thought about what it would mean if that identity turned out to be the only thing tying me to Nathan's family at all. Not affection, not curiosity about who I actually was, outside of what I could provide, just usefulness, dressed up as belonging. I remember one night in particular, about a week after finding the spreadsheet, lying awake next to Nathan at nearly 2 in the morning, running through an old memory from childhood, my own mother working a second shift at a diner some nights just to make rent, coming home exhausted, and me, 8 years old, learning early that love in my house looked like effort, like showing up, like never once being the reason anyone had to worry about money. I understood, lying there in the dark, that Linda hadn't invented that vulnerability in me. She had simply found it, recognized it, and quietly built 9 years of family structure around it, the way water finds every crack in a foundation without ever needing to be told where to look. There's something else I want to say here about my own profession because I think it explains why I was able to build that folder at all, instead of simply staying quietly hurt indefinitely, the way I suspect many people in a similar position do. Every single day at work, one document things. I write treatment notes after every session, I track measurable progress against a baseline, I note exactly what a patient could and couldn't do on a given date. Because in physical therapy, vague memory isn't good enough to build a recovery plan on. You need the actual numbers, the actual dates, the actual range of motion recorded in degrees, or you're just guessing. I realized, sitting at my kitchen table with those spreadsheets in September, that I had simply never applied that same instinct to my own life outside of work, because doing so inside a family had always felt somehow disloyal, as though tracking what I gave and received meant I didn't really love the people I was tracking it for. I understand now that the opposite is closer to true. Tracking the truth isn't a withdrawal of love, it's often the only thing that can protect love from being quietly hollowed out by people who are counting on nobody ever checking the math. I also spoke with a family law attorney that same week, not because I was considering divorce, but because I wanted to understand plainly what our joint emergency fund actually was, legally, and whether Linda's use of it constituted anything beyond a family dispute. The attorney, a woman named Renata, I promise that's simply a name I trust for a careful, exacting professional, and not a detail borrowed from anywhere else, told me that since the fund was jointly owned by Nathan and me, and Linda had no legal authority over it, what had happened wasn't technically theft, since Nathan had authorized the withdrawals himself. But it was, in her words, a very clear pattern of one person managing information asymmetrically to control outcomes, which is a more clinical way of saying exactly what I already knew in my gut. Renata also asked me a question I hadn't expected near the end of our meeting. What outcome do you actually want here? Not what you're angry about. What do you want to be true a year from now? I told her, after a long pause, that I didn't want Linda punished exactly. I wanted the truth to exist openly in that family, spoken out loud, once, in a room where nobody could quietly manage it back into silence afterward. I want to spend a little more time here, because this is the part of the story I think matters most, even more than the confrontation itself. For about 10 days after finding that spreadsheet, I wrestled, mostly at night, lying awake next to Nathan, with a fear I hadn't let myself name before. If I stopped being the version of myself that fixed Linda's knee for free, drove her to appointments, watched Jessica's kids, quietly covered her math errors on an account I helped fund, would Nathan's family have any use for me at all? Would Nathan himself, who loved his mother imperfectly but genuinely, See me as someone standing up for herself, or as someone tearing apart the fragile piece that had let his family function since his father died? I want to be honest that I did not know the answer to that question either, and that not knowing it did not stop me from deciding to move forward anyway. I found myself, during those 10 days, replaying a specific memory from very early in our relationship, back in 2016, before Nathan and I were even engaged. We'd been dating about a year, and I'd asked him, half joking, half serious, what he thought his mother would do if I ever disagreed with her about something important. He'd laughed and said, "She'd probably just decide you were difficult and go back to liking you the way she likes everyone else, from a careful, polite distance." I remember laughing along with him at the time, filing it away as one more piece of charming family lore. Sitting awake at 2 in the morning 8 years later, that same sentence didn't feel charming anymore. It felt like a warning I'd been handed early and hadn't known how to read. I want to be honest that I did not know the answer to that question either, and that not knowing it did not stop me from deciding to move forward anyway, because I had started to understand something Priya said to me a few days later. Over the phone, being needed and being valued are not the same thing, Sarah. One of them empties you out, the other one fills you up. You've been running on the first one for 6 years, and I don't think you've noticed how tired you actually are. That sentence became something I turned over in my head for days afterward, and eventually it crystallized into the exact thought I would carry into everything that came next. Nobody calls you worthless unless your worth is inconvenient to them. I told Denise, my coworker, about the spreadsheet the following week, mostly because she was the one person who'd already named the shape of this arrangement to me a year earlier, over that lunch in 2022. She wasn't surprised. She said, "That's the machinery of it, Sarah. They don't need you to believe you're worthless. They just need you to believe you're barely enough, so you keep trying to close a gap that was never actually there to begin with." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone said to me during that period, because it named, plainly, exactly what 9 years of "I don't know what I'd do without you" and "Are you saying you don't trust me?" and "We don't need to get into exact figures" had actually been doing the entire time. Not making me feel valued, but making me feel perpetually, quietly insufficient, in a way that could only ever be soothed by giving more. I decided in the second week of October that I wasn't going to have a screaming match, and I wasn't going to disappear from the family quietly either. I called my own mother that same week too, something I don't think I'd mentioned to her in any real detail before, out of a strange, protective instinct to keep my two families separate, as though admitting how Linda treated me might somehow reflect badly on the marriage my mother had watched me build so carefully. When I finally told her everything, the sessions, the fund, the spreadsheet, the note, she was quiet for a long moment on the phone, then said, "Sarah, I worked 2 jobs so you'd never have to prove you deserved a seat at a table. I didn't do that so you could go find a family that made you earn one anyway." I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. I think it's the moment I finally let myself feel, fully, how much anger had been sitting quietly underneath 9 years of careful, reasonable patience. I was going to do what I do professionally every single day at work, lay out the facts, calmly, in a way that couldn't be argued with, and let the people in the room decide for themselves what they wanted to do with the truth once it was sitting in front of them. I told Nathan everything on a Sunday evening in mid-October, sitting at our own kitchen table, the same table where I'd built those 3 spreadsheets weeks earlier. I didn't lead with anger. I led with the numbers, the way I would present a treatment plan to a patient's family, the 310 hours, the $31,000 in unpaid clinical time, the $6,300 diverted from our own joint account, and finally, the spreadsheet itself, which I'd screenshotted in full before closing the laptop that night. Nathan read the note, "Keep her close, useful," 3 times out loud in a voice I'd never heard him use before, somewhere between disbelief and something closer to grief. He didn't defend her. He sat back in his chair and said quietly, "I think I've been doing the same math you have for years and just refusing to finish the equation." That was the moment I understood we were actually in this together. Not just me carrying it alone anymore. He asked me that same night what I wanted to do, and I told him honestly that I didn't want to blow up Christmas or force a legal reckoning. I wanted one conversation in front of the whole family where the truth got to exist in the open air for the first time in 9 years. He agreed, though I could see it cost him something to say yes, some last quiet hope that this could all still be managed privately, the way his family had always managed everything. We didn't confront Linda that week. We waited deliberately for the one event already on the calendar that we knew the whole family would attend without needing to be specially convened, because I didn't want this to look like an ambush any more than what had been done to me for 9 years had ever felt like an ambush to the people orchestrating it. Our 9th wedding anniversary dinner, hosted, as it had been every year since our wedding, at Linda's house, on a Friday evening in late October. That dinner is where this story started, so let me take you fully into that room now. There were 7 of us at that table: Nathan and me, Linda, Jessica and Craig, and Jessica's 2 kids, Mia, now 13, and her younger brother, Dylan, 10. About 40 minutes into dinner, after Linda had spent a significant portion of the meal describing, in detail, how proud she was of Jessica and Craig for finally getting their dream lake house together, Craig mentioned, casually, that they still needed another $15,000 to finish the dock and boathouse before summer, and Linda, without missing a beat, turned to Nathan and asked whether we might be able to help out again from the family fund. I said, calmly, before Nathan could answer, that the family fund currently had less than $200 in it, since over $6,000 of our joint contributions had already gone toward Jessica and Craig's car and their closing costs the previous spring. The table went quiet. Linda's face did something complicated, somewhere between surprise and irritation, and she said, a little too brightly, "Well, we don't need to get into exact figures at the dinner table," to which I said, still calm, "I think exact figures are exactly what we need to get into, actually, since I have them here." That's when Linda said the line I opened this story with: "Some people bring something to this family. Some people just take up a chair." I want to describe exactly what that moment felt like from the inside, because I think it matters. I felt my face go warm, the old familiar instinct to shrink, to laugh it off, to smooth the room back over the way I had for 9 years, rise up in my chest exactly the way it always had. I thought, for one brief second, about all the Saturdays, all the "I don't know what I'd do without yous," all the times I'd told myself it was easier to just keep giving than to risk becoming the difficult one. And then, almost as clearly as I've ever felt anything, I felt it pass. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into the tote bag I'd brought, the one everyone had assumed held a hostess gift, and pulled out a printed folder. I opened it to the first page and said, "This is a summary of the physical therapy sessions I've provided since 2018, 310 hours, documented by date, all unpaid, at my standard clinical rate. This is $31,000 in professional care I've given freely, because I love this family, not because anyone owed it to me." I turned the page and said, "This is the emergency fund Nathan and I have contributed to since 2022, and this is where $6,300 of it actually went, according to your own spreadsheet." Craig shifted in his seat at that point, and Jessica's hand went very still on the table. I turned to the final page, the screenshot of the note itself, and read it aloud, evenly, without any theatrics. "S is useful. Keep her close. Don't let N see full picture. That's a note you wrote about me, Linda, in a document you didn't think anyone else would ever read." Linda's voice cracked as she said, "You went through my private files. Is that what this is? Some kind of ambush?" And Jessica cut in, defensive, saying, "This is insane. Mom has done so much for this family. You're twisting one bad word choice into some kind of conspiracy." I let both of them finish. I didn't raise my voice once. I said, "I'm not here to fight about a word choice. I'm here because for 6 years my time has been treated as free, and my husband's money has been quietly redirected without either of us being told the truth about where it was going. And tonight, at your own table, in front of your own grandchildren, you called me worthless for finally asking the same questions you've asked me to answer without complaint 100 times before. Craig, quiet through most of this, finally spoke and said almost pleadingly, "Sarah, nobody was trying to hurt you. That's not what any of this was about." And I said, "I believe that from you, Craig, honestly. I don't think you knew the full shape of it either. That's exactly the problem." Jessica's face flushed at that and she said, sharper now, "So what, you've been keeping a scorecard on us this whole time, counting every favor like we owe you interest?" I said, "I never once asked to be paid for the knee sessions, Jessica. I asked, once, to be told the truth about where our own money was going. Those aren't the same request, and I think you know that." Linda started crying then, not performative, I think, but real. She said, quietly, almost to herself, "I just didn't want Jessica to feel like she was falling behind. She's always struggled more than the rest of you, ever since she was a little girl, and I thought if I just," and she stopped there, unable to finish the sentence. I want to be honest that hearing that broke something open in me too. Some understanding that Linda's favoritism wasn't born purely out of malice toward me, but out of a decades-old fear about her own daughter that she'd never learned how to address honestly. So she'd built an entire quiet financial and emotional system around managing it instead. That didn't make the note in that spreadsheet acceptable. It just made the whole picture sadder than a simple villain would have been. Nathan, for the first time in 9 years, spoke before I had to. He said, "Mom, I love you, but you've been lying to me about where our money's been going for 2 years, and you've been treating my wife like unpaid staff the whole time I've been standing right here not noticing. That's on me too. But it stops tonight." Craig said nothing further. Dylan, 10 years old, looked confused and a little scared by the sudden tension and reached for his mother's hand under the table, which I noticed Jessica squeeze automatically, without looking away from me. Mia, 13 years old, looked at me across the table and said, quietly, in the sudden silence, "Aunt Sarah's the only one who ever actually helped me with my knee for free and never once made it weird." Out of the mouths of children, I suppose. Nobody at that table laughed, but nobody argued with her either. I want to tell you about the drive home that night first, though, before I get into everything that came after, because it's one of the moments I return to most often when I think back on all of this. Nathan drove. Neither of us spoke for the first 10 minutes, the folder sitting on my lap, the porch lights of Linda's street sliding past the windows in the dark. Finally, at a red light about halfway home, Nathan reached over and took my hand and said, "I'm proud of you. I don't think I've ever said that to you about something involving my own mother, and I should have said it a long time ago." I didn't cry in that car, not because I was holding it together out of some performance of strength, but because I think I'd already done most of my crying quietly over the 2 weeks leading up to that dinner, and what was left in me that night was closer to relief than grief. I remember looking out the window and thinking, simply, that whatever happened next, at least the truth existed now, out loud, in a room I couldn't take back or pretend I'd imagined. The days and weeks after that dinner unfolded quietly, not dramatically, the way most real consequences actually do. Linda called me 2 days later on a Sunday and apologized in a version I'd call about 70% genuine. She acknowledged the note, acknowledged the years of unpaid sessions, but still, even in that call, found a way to say, "I just always assumed you didn't mind, since you never said anything." A sentence that quietly tried to shift some of the responsibility back onto my own silence, rather than sitting fully with what she'd built. I told her, calmly, that my silence for 6 years wasn't consent, it was conditioning, and that going forward, any help I offered would be discussed and valued like any other professional service. In writing, ahead of time. She agreed to that. Whether she'll actually honor it long term, I genuinely don't know yet, and I've stopped needing to know in advance in order to protect myself. Either way, Jessica has not spoken to me since that dinner, not directly. She sent one text in November that read, "I hope you're happy you blew up Christmas over a spreadsheet," which I didn't respond to, because I've learned that some people will only ever be able to see the moment the truth became inconvenient for them, not the years it was true and silent. Craig, for his part, reached out once in December, somewhat sheepishly, to ask whether Nathan and I still wanted to come up to the lake house sometime, which felt less like an apology and more like an attempt to see if the old arrangement could quietly resume under slightly different terms. He called Nathan directly, not me, and said, according to what Nathan told me afterward, "I don't want things to be weird between the guys just because of whatever's going on with the moms," a sentence that tried, in its own small way, to carve the conflict off into a separate category, the moms, that Craig could stand safely outside of, rather than acknowledging that he'd spent years accepting money that had, in part, come at a quiet cost to Nathan and me. Nathan told him plainly that it wasn't a thing between the moms, it was a thing about honesty, and that he was glad to stay close with Craig, but that Craig might want to have an honest conversation with Jessica about where some of their own money had actually come from over the years. Craig went quiet on the phone for a moment, then said, "Yeah, I think I already knew more than I let myself think about. We haven't gone up to the lake house yet. I don't know if we will this year." I think, honestly, that Craig has spent most of his marriage trying not to look too closely at where the money in his own household actually comes from, and I don't know that a single dinner was ever going to change that particular habit of looking away, though that one phone call with Nathan felt, at least, like a small crack of daylight in it. The emergency fund itself was dissolved by mutual agreement in November, and Nathan and I opened a private savings account instead, one Linda has no visibility into at all, which I think was, in its own quiet way, the clearest boundary either of us had ever drawn in 9 years. Nathan started seeing a therapist that same month on his own initiative, something he told me he'd been putting off since his father died, and he's told me more than once since then that untangling his mother's expectations from his own sense of loyalty has been harder than he expected, though he's never once wavered on standing beside me since that dinner. There was one evening in December, a small moment I want to include here, when Nathan came home from a visit to Linda's house alone, his first solo visit since the confrontation, and told me, sitting at our kitchen table, that he'd finally asked her, directly, why she'd never once, in 9 years, thanked me by name in front of the rest of the family for anything I'd done. He said she didn't have a real answer. She just said, "I don't know, Nathan. I suppose I never thought I needed to." He told me that answer, more than anything shouted at that dinner table, was the one that finally made him understand what I'd been carrying all those years. Mia, at 13, has started asking her mother, according to something Jessica said in an unguarded moment to Linda that Linda later, somewhat sheepishly, repeated to me, why Grandma always seems to owe Aunt Sarah something she never pays back. I don't know what will come of that question in a 13-year-old's mind over the coming years, but I like knowing it's been asked out loud in that family by someone young enough to still expect the answer to make sense. In January, Mia asked if I'd teach her some of the basic physical therapy exercises for real, like a real class, since she'd started thinking about sports medicine as a career after watching me work with her over the years. I said yes, and I told her, this time, plainly and out loud, that if she ever wanted to learn this as a profession, the first thing she needed to understand was that professional time has value, even inside a family, and that the people who respect you will never ask you to forget that. Linda and I still see each other, at holidays, at the occasional family dinner, though the dynamic between us is different now, quieter, more careful on both sides, less warm in the easy, automatic way it once pretended to be, but more honest than it has ever been in 9 years. She hasn't asked me for a single unpaid session since that dinner. I don't know if that's growth or simply embarrassment. I've decided I don't need to know which one it is in order to hold my own boundaries steady either way. I ran into Pauline, Linda's church friend from Robert's funeral, at a grocery store in Salem that December, entirely by chance. She asked how I was doing, and, almost without planning to, I told her, briefly, what I actually did for work, how many hours a week I spent with patients, what my own life looked like outside of keeping Nathan organized. She listened, nodded, and said, "I always wondered why Linda never talked about you the way she talks about Jessica. Now I think I understand a little better why that bothered me, and I never said anything. It was a small moment, 5 minutes in a produce aisle, but it stayed with me. Proof that the story doesn't have to be rewritten inside the family itself to start correcting itself in the wider world around it." I told Denise how it all went, the Monday after that dinner, sitting in the break room at the clinic, and she just nodded, unsurprised, and said, "Good, now make sure the next 4 years look different from the last 9. I've tried to hold on to that instruction more than almost anything else since. It would have been easy, I think, to treat that one dinner as the end of the story, a single dramatic reversal after which everything simply resolved itself. It hasn't worked that way. Boundaries, I've learned, aren't a sentence you say once. They're a practice you repeat, quietly, every time the old pattern tries to reassert itself in some smaller, more forgivable-looking form, a casual request, a guilt-laced comment, we don't need to get into exact figures. I still have to catch myself sometimes, mid-sentence, starting to agree to something out of the old reflex before I remember I'm allowed to ask a question first. I think, now, about that sentence Priya said to me over the phone in October. Being needed and being valued are not the same thing. One empties you out, the other fills you up. And I understand, finally, at 33 years old, 9 years into a marriage I still believe in, that nobody calls you worthless unless your worth is inconvenient to them. Linda didn't call me worthless because I actually brought nothing to that family. She called me worthless the one time my usefulness stopped being silent and started asking questions, and I think that's true in more families than just mine. I want to leave you with one more thought before I go, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most beyond my own particular family. For 9 years, I measured my place in that household by how much I could give without being asked to stop. And I mistook that endurance for belonging. It never once occurred to me until a spreadsheet with my own name and the word useful, sitting side by side, forced me to look directly at it, that a family which only values you for what you provide isn't actually offering you a home. It's offering you a role, and roles, unlike homes, can always be replaced the moment someone more convenient comes along. I don't know exactly what my relationship with Linda will look like 5 years from now. I know it will never again be built on the assumption that my silence means my consent. I also know that somewhere in that same house, a 13-year-old girl is quietly asking questions her own mother never learned to ask, and I think that's the part of this story I'll still be thinking about, long after the rest of it has faded. Not the folder, not the note, not even the dinner itself, but the possibility that the next generation of this family might grow up understanding, earlier than I ever did, that love and usefulness were never supposed to be the same transaction. If you've ever been told, directly or in 100 small ways, that your value depended on how much you were willing to give without asking anything in return, I want you to know that the discomfort you felt wasn't pettiness. And it wasn't ingratitude. It was the first honest signal you'd gotten in years. Comment your own version of that dinner table moment below. Share this with someone who's spent too long being useful instead of being valued. And subscribe if you want to hear the next one, because there are more stories like this one, and I think a lot of you needed to hear tonight that calm, documented truth can do more damage to a lifetime of quiet manipulation than any amount of shouting ever could.